Dark Souls and its relatives are some of the most influential and talked about video games of all time, and I must admit that I too worship at the altar of From Software and the pantheon of outstanding action RPGs. So I figured, why not toss my hat into the ring? These games are simply too good not to talk about. From the combat, amazing and epic boss fights, ball-busting difficulty, there's a lot that goes into a good Soulsborne. Oh, and just a quick disclaimer, I've only played the PS5 remake of Demon Souls and the Scholar of the First Sin edition of Dark Souls 2, so that's what I'm basing this off of. Alright, let's get started. Demon Souls deserves a tremendous amount of credit for being the first game of the series and for getting so much right the first time around. The gameplay loop, combat system, leveling, all of it has remained basically unchanged since this game. It's a very impressive start to the Souls pantheon, and it's also the FromSoft game that I enjoy the least. The areas and bosses are just not quite as memorable here as they are in future games. Also, I have some issues with the way this game is structured. You see, you have the choice of going to any level you want at any time via this sort of hub world. I think that this kind of structure would make more sense for a platformer rather than an action RPG. I prefer the games that have all the areas be part of the same world. Also, since this is an RPG, this means that the game starts out really punishing and it actually gets easier as you go on. It's the opposite of how it should be. A lot of the bosses, most of them even, are just straight up not that good. The weakest set of fights by far. The Man-Eater's fight, for example, feels like it barely even functions. Don't even get me started on the Dragon God. There are only 3 standout bosses in this game, which is pretty low. Though I will give credit where it's due. The Penetrator can be seen as a prototype for Artorias, and it also starts the long-standing tradition of FromSoft horny posting on main with their boss design. It doesn't help that this game has the least amount of content, being beatable in under 20 hours, and it ends super anticlimactically. I was so disappointed when I saw the credits. I know this seems like a lot of complaints, but we are grading on a pretty steep curve here. Keep in mind, my opinion on this game as a whole is unambiguously positive. What's here is good, it's just that other games do it better. As the genesis of the Souls series, Demon Souls is remarkable. As a competitor with other FromSoft titles, it's by far the weakest. Dark Souls 2 is a video game, and that's about all you can say without pissing someone off. Look, this might sound harsh, but I genuinely can't think of a single thing that Dark Souls 2 does better than the original. The bosses are worse, the world design is significantly worse, the Estus takes a million years to drink, and there's some truly terrible enemy placement. Looking at you, Iron Keep. Dark Souls 2, in all honesty, just doesn't do its job as a sequel very well. Oh well, at least it's a pretty great video game. Yeah, in spite of this game's problems, and trust me, it has many, it's a pretty enjoyable experience. I mean, with combat as good as this, it's pretty hard not to enjoy yourself. There's just a lot that holds this one back from true greatness. Let's start with adaptability. Once you know what the deal is, it's fine, but how the fuck were we supposed to know that our dodge rolls were nerfed into oblivion without dumping 20 points into a stat that hasn't existed before or since? There's just a lot of little things that really irk me about this one. I already mentioned the Estus. I swear half of my deaths were from this alone. Walking through fog gates no longer gives you iframes. Performing actions in the world no longer gives you iframes. You can't level up at bonfires anymore. On top of having easily the worst shitboxes in the entire series and the most obnoxious boss runbacks. None of these things are a deal breaker, it's just they all add up and it kind of dampens the experience. And it's a shame too, because this game has some genuinely great ideas and highlights, especially in the DLC. Most of the areas are fun to explore, and the fragrant branches of yore and Pharos Lockstones are welcome additions. And while the quantity over quality approach to boss fights kind of rubs me the wrong way, there are quite a few diamonds in the rough, such as the Looking Glass Knight, Velstadt, the Dark Lurker, and especially the Fume Knight and Sir Alum, which are downright iconic. Dark Souls 2 is terrible and amazing, often at the same time. For better and for worse, it's more memorable than Demon Souls for me, which gives it the edge over that game. I don't really like it as a sequel too much, but I do enjoy it as a video game. Dark Souls 3 is plain awesome. So awesome that it feels wrong to rank it at only number 5, but that's just how great these games are. Dark Souls 3 excels in one key area: boss fights. This game's boss design blows 1 and 2 out of the water most of the time, and I'm not just talking about visuals. Sure, the visual design is spectacular, but the mechanics are also on a whole different level. This game takes Bloodborne's fast-paced approach to combat and applies it to the Souls series. Both the player character and your opponents are much faster, which makes the fight so much more exciting and hectic while still feeling 100% fair since the attacks are well telegraphed. Many of the series' best fights are found in this game. There's the Dancer, Nameless King, Twin Princess, Sister Freed, Midir, motherfucking Slave Knight Gale. I'd be here all day if I tried to name every great fight. I want to rank this game higher, and I would if it weren't for the level design. It's not bad or anything, far from it, it's just I don't really look forward to most of the areas in this game like I do for the other games. Of course, there are exceptions. Irithyll is magnificent, and the Ringed City is one of the best levels in Souls history. However, there are some real stinkers. Farron Keep is probably the worst poison swamp we've ever seen, Irithyll Dungeon is a nightmare, Smoldering Lake's a huge pain in the ass, and the Profaned Capital is just kinda there. Also, I feel like this game kinda takes a while to get going. It's not until the second half where this game really hits its stride. And I'm not really a fan of the more linear world design. There are a couple forks in the road, but they don't really feel like they serve much purpose, and the levels are very disconnected from each other, which makes the world as a whole less compelling. In Dark Souls 1, and to some extent 2, the levels coalesce to form something greater than the sum of their parts, and that aspect is not present here. I am a fan of the enemy design, however, with my favorites being the Ring Knights and the giant enemy crabs. I just think it's hilarious how the crabs of all things are among the most powerful entities in the entire series. Dark Souls 3 is fantastic. A damn near perfect end to the trilogy. Near perfect. Sekiro's combat system is one of the most interesting and compelling combat systems I've ever had the privilege of experiencing. When pushed to its limits, I even think it surpasses what's offered in the other Souls games. The best fights in Sekiro have this amazing, lightning-fast, blow-for-blow kinetic energy to them. You can respond to everything that the boss does, meaning there's no downtime whatsoever if played correctly. It feels amazing to fight these bosses. Getting good at Sekiro is one of the most rewarding gaming experiences I've ever had. Oh, but remember what I said about Dark Souls 3? How it has great bosses but not so great areas? Well, I feel kind of the same about Sekiro, only the disparity between the level and boss design is even greater. This is easily the most consistent set of bosses out of any of these games, while the levels are easily the most forgettable. I don't know, the design just doesn't feel as deliberate as the other Souls games. There are some fun enemies sprinkled here and there, but Sekiro's combat just doesn't work that well when you have less powerful but more numerous foes. Under the right conditions, Sekiro's combat is truly transcendent, but I think traditional Souls combat is more versatile. It works great for levels and bosses, and I don't really like the stealth very much. I think it was underdeveloped. And there's not a whole lot of reason to fight these enemies in the first place. Sekiro isn't really an RPG, so you can just run straight to the boss if you want. And who could blame you? I love almost every fight in this game, particularly the one-on-one sword duels. Those are just unreal. Except for those damn headless. Fuck these things. But yeah, overall, Sekiro is a masterpiece. I'm really excited to see what else FromSoft can do with this IP. It'd be a damn shame if this is all we got. Dark Souls is the video game. The reason we're talking about these games at all. Demon Souls might have laid the groundwork, but Dark Souls took it to the next level. This is one of the most influential games to come out in the past 20 years. It's the reason we have the terms like Soulsborne, Souls-like, Souls anything. There's a magic unique to this game that made it such a hit on release and that keeps us coming back all these years later. People who haven't played Dark Souls mostly know it as the hard game, and while its difficulty is certainly a factor in its appeal, anyone who's played it knows that it's so much more than that. One of Dark Souls' biggest strengths is its world design. Lordran is by far the most compelling world that FromSoft have ever created. I love the interconnectivity of it, I love the verticality of it, and the sheer freedom you have when exploring it. If you want to get your ass kicked in New Londo or the Catacombs at a low level, you can do that. Another crazy thing about this game is that they don't give you fast travel until you're halfway through the game. What's even crazier is that I prefer it this way. Yeah, I like having to carefully plan my routes. It extends the slow, decision-based combat into the exploration. You have to decide if it's really worth taking another step into a completely unknown, dangerous area. Descending upon Blighttown for the first time wouldn't have nearly the same impact if you could just get the fuck out whenever you wanted. No, you're stuck here, and you have to fight your way out. And yes, for the record, I'm one of those weirdos who actually likes Blighttown. I really like most of the areas in this game, in fact. They're so well designed, with carefully and deliberately placed shortcuts, enemies, loot, and traps. A far cry from the enemy spam of Dark Souls 2. Sen's Fortress is a sadistically enjoyable funhouse of pain, and Orlando is one of the most iconic areas in the series. Darkroot Garden is amazingly atmospheric, and I got goosebumps the first time I stumbled upon Ash Lake. Oh, and yeah, this is easily the most atmospheric and immersive game in the series, another thing that the lack of fast travel improves. Sure, other games would go on to do boss fights a lot better, but even this one has a few masterpiece fights tucked away, such as the ever-popular Ornstein and Smough, Sif, Quelaag, and Artorias and Manus are some of the best fights in the entire series. Even some of the lesser fights have some punch to them given their relative infrequence to Dark Souls 2. Much has been said regarding the second half of the game and how it's not as good as the first. And while I agree, I don't think there's much that's too bad aside from the Tomb of the Giants and Bed of Chaos. It's also heavily elevated by the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, which exceeds the quality of the base game at points, typical for a FromSoft DLC. Dark Souls just has a certain vibe to it that hasn't quite been replicated. It's a flawed game for sure, but it's undoubtedly a masterpiece. I fucking love Bloodborne. It was my first FromSoft game, so maybe I'm a bit biased, but I really do think the game is that good. Starting out, I was honestly a little frustrated. I had trouble getting used to how much weight there was to your character's movements relative to other action games, and the difficulty doesn't pull any punches even early on. However, once I got the hang of the combat and started making some real progress, this game clicked with me like almost no other game has clicked with me before. I found myself completely immersed in the world and really enjoying the fast, bloody, visceral combat that this game has to offer. I'll once again admit my bias, since horror-themed anything is right up my alley, but the horror aesthetics actually serve a purpose beyond being great to look at, though this game is fucking beautiful. This is one of few games that really unsettled me while I was playing it, particularly in the second half of Old Yharnam and the Upper Cathedral Ward. It was a combination of the dark, detailed environments, the amazingly ghoulish enemy design, and perhaps my inexperience with the combat at the time that made me genuinely nervous to take another step at points. The horror aesthetic isn't just a pretty new coat of paint, it's actually integral to the experience. Well, my experience anyways. This is on top of the fact that Bloodborne has the most consistent levels of the entire series. I don't dislike a single area in this game, and I can't say that about any of the others. These areas are large, complex, dense with cool enemies and loot, and the visual design is spectacular. Central Yharnam is downright labyrinthian and easily one of my favorite opening levels in any game. Cainhurst Castle is an incredible hidden level with unmatched vibes, killer boss fight, and the research hall feels almost like a Zelda dungeon, which is another great way to score points with me. The bosses are very consistent too, with the only one I truly dislike being Mikolash. And I do love the subtle yet important changes they made to the combat. The rally system perfectly complements the faster enemies and gives this game its own unique identity. The trick weapons are also great and something I wish they would bring back. Each weapon has a much deeper moveset and it allows for actual combos instead of just R1 spam. I prefer having fewer but better weapons. I haven't even mentioned the Old Hunters, which is probably my favorite FromSoft DLC. Anyone who plays these games would know that that's saying quite a lot. The Old Hunters is somehow even better than the already high quality of the base game, with each new area and boss being among the series' best. I could spend all day praising this game and still not find every good thing to say. My only complaints are that the base game is kinda short when compared to other titles, and that the Hunter NPC fights feel kinda broken. And I'm not really a fan of grinding for blood vials either. That aside, Bloodborne is a remarkably consistent experience. I would love to get a sequel sometime in the future, but I'd settle for a remaster on PS5 that runs at 60 frames. FromSoft has to do more with this IP, it's too good not to. Everybody's got that gateway game. You know, a game from your childhood that transformed your perception of what video games are capable of. For me, it was The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. When I played it at the age of 10 or so, I was completely blown away by its scope and ambition, as it was greater than any title I had experienced up to that point. I've played a great many games since that I've loved, obviously, but not quite matched that special feeling. The feeling I got playing Elden Ring was closest to matching my gateway game as any other game I've ever played. Elden Ring was actually the first FromSoft game that I got to experience on release. I was hyped as hell for it, and it somehow managed to exceed my ludicrously high expectations. From the moment the open world was introduced, I was completely hooked. Then, after completing the first dungeon, I knew that this game was an all-timer.
The crazy thing is that most of the core mechanics have existed before in previous games. However, I think the open world format suits these systems beautifully and elevates them to their highest potential. Exploring the lands between is utterly enthralling. Around every corner, there's dungeons to explore, entire underground areas to discover, enemies with the craziest movesets you've ever seen, and sweet, sweet loot. Elden Ring does exploration better than any open world game I've ever played, with the only possible exceptions being Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And on top of that, you have traditional Souls combat with more freedom than ever before thanks to Ashes of War. I also love how this game is able to be accessible to new players without compromising FromSoft's design philosophy. The game isn't handholdy at all, but it still allows players who are struggling a way forward. But you can still skill your way through encounters if you want to, and it's incredibly rewarding. On top of this, the game has some of the most complex, dense, well-designed dungeons in the entire series. And on top of that, we have some of the most awe-inspiring boss fights ever conceived. Oh, and did I mention we can finally level up at bonfires again? Thank you, FromSoft. Never take this away from us again. Playing Elden Ring for the first time was an unforgettable experience. I'll never forget taking the 5-minute long elevator ride to Siofa River and being stopped dead in my tracks with the gorgeous view. I'll never forget my jaw hitting the floor when Godric cut off his own arm mid-fight to replace it with a dragon head. I'll never forget fighting Moog for 3 whole hours and the satisfaction of finally beating him through sheer determination, or finding Estelle at the bottom of the Lake of Rot, or seeing crumbling Faraz Missoula for the first time, or getting annihilated by Dragonlord Prestigisax's lasers. There's so much dope shit in this game. FromSoft really spoiled us with the amount of content Elden Ring has to offer. It's by far the largest game. And yeah, you bet your ass I'm looking forward to the DLC. I can't wait to get my ass kicked by whatever unholy abominations they can conjure up. I could talk about this game all day and still not say everything I have to say about it. It's not perfect, no game is, but it's certainly a masterpiece. It's not only my favorite open world game, not only my favorite Soulsborne game, but one of my favorite games, period. Hell, it just might be my favorite game. I'll have to get back to you on that. Let me know what your favorite Souls games are down in the comments. Did you agree, disagree with anything I said? Leave a like if you like, subscribe if you want to see more. I have plenty more to say about these games if you'll indulge me, but that's it for today. So, see you later, and thanks for watching.